Hello, everyone. I'm Stephanie Boozer with CUGC HQ, and I'm excited to welcome you to today's user share webinar. I don't want to take up too much time because I know we have a lot of stuff for Mike to get to today, but I did want to point out that we had some upcoming events that you might be interested in. Tomorrow, our Women in Technology program is having a conversation with Ava Helene. She's an author. I think the title of her book is Women in Technology, a book for guys. So this conversation tomorrow isn't just for women in tech, it's for everyone. It's all about her research and things that you can do in your own workplace to kind of make it an equitable environment for everybody. Also coming up is our CUGC XL, our first in-person XL event in a long time. We're having it in Kansas City, but you don't have to be in Kansas City. We're welcoming everyone from CUGC all over, anywhere. So check those out. You can take a screenshot, that link right there to our events calendar will get you to both of these and other events that we have coming up. All right, really briefly, I have some housekeeping for you. We are recording today's presentation and you will get a link to that recording. It's going to come to you tomorrow in an email from GoToWebinar. We'll also post this up on our YouTube page, and I can put a link to our YouTube page in the chat in just a bit. We'd like you to ask questions anytime. Just put them in the chat as you have them so you don't forget them, and we'll take as many as we can today. All right, I'm going to hand things over to Mike in just a second, but I do want to congratulate Mike on his new CTP status. So yay, Mike. Thank you so much for doing this with us today. Mike is also a leader of our Los Angeles CUGC group. You can find him on Twitter, and he's got a website there. You can take a screenshot here and get to all his stuff. But also we have with us Shane O'Neill, another CTP. Congratulations on continuing your CTP status. And Shane's going to take a look at all the questions you put in. He's going to help with the Q&A discussion. So like I said, don't be shy, ask your questions. We're here to answer them. All right, so Mike, I am going to send you the screen and I'm going to disappear in a bit and I'll be back at the end. Just a second, coming to you maybe. Okay, there it goes.
All right. There we go. So, welcome to my top 10 Citrix Optimizations Revisited talk. I've given this talk a couple of times and I've decided to change it up a bit this time just to try and freshen it up a little bit. And I've also changed my mind on a couple of topics and I'll speak to them as they pop up. So if you've seen the talk before, you'll be familiar with a lot of what's going to pop up in here. If you haven't, welcome and thanks for joining. So who am I? Well, I'm a newly minted Citrix technology professional. Prior to that, I was a CTA for 2 years. I'm a Citrix certified expert in virtualization. I'm a Citrix certified professional in networking and also Citrix Cloud. I'm currently a VDI architect, formerly a consultant, and also a delivery engineer. So I do a bit of everything, a bit of implementation, a bit of pre-sales work, and a bit of design. Possibly a wizard, if my Twitter profile picture is to be believed. You can find Twitter links with the little QR code with the bird up the top, and you can also find me on LinkedIn. So what is this talk about? It is about optimizations. Optimize being from the Latin word optimus. So I'm going to talk about optimizations that I think are relevant to Citrix environments right now. And a lot of these settings are based on what I've seen in client environments, sort of over the last few years, really. What we want to do when we're optimizing is to get the best outcome obtainable under the conditions. Now, the conditions are obviously going to be different in every environment, and the main thing that we want to optimize really is around user experience, because if we're not optimizing for user experience, then what are we doing essentially? If you spend all your time optimizing for, say, speed of deployment, that's fantastic. We can set up image automation frameworks, and you can push a button and have new images deployed within 5 minutes with all the Windows updates, and that's all great. But if it still takes 5 minutes for people to log in, it's not really keeping your end users happy. So when we're talking about optimizing in this talk, we're talking about optimizing end user experience. Now, this is my top tip. Before we get started on anything else, and this has come up recently because of the changes with daylight savings, but make sure NTP is configured everywhere, and make sure that things are syncing time correctly. What we've seen recently is with the changes to daylight savings, a lot of non-persistent machines will reboot and they will be an hour off. And when you're that far out with NTP, you can run into issues where you cannot then sync time back to the domain because the drift is too large. What you essentially need to do in these situations is reseal the image after it has been synced to the domain and pulled down any new time zone files that it needs to pull down and made any changes to its local time that it needs to make, and then push the image out. So if that means that you need to stay up until midnight, whatever, when the time changes, then so be it, really. But what a lot of people have seen in the last couple of weeks is that letting the non-persistent images just update time on their own can cause them to not register with the delivery controllers. So basically, time in a Citrix environment is very important. You need it because you need to have accurate time to be able to log in and get your Kerberos tickets, because if your time is out, you're not going to be able to authenticate. One thing to keep in mind, especially people on VMware vSphere environments, is that when your non-persistent machines reboot, they're going to pull their time from the VMware host. Even if you have the setting turned off, like with VMware tools that don't sync time to host, because they don't have any other source of time when they boot, their BIOS clock is essentially syncing to the time of the vSphere host. Now, if you don't have NTP enabled on all your hosts for some reason, that can cause really weird issues. And I have been at a client where one host out of 6 didn't have NTP, and it was drifting so far that any VMs that booted on this host weren't able to join the domain. And it took a while to track down, but eventually we figured out that it was just because the little checkbox to sync with NTP for that host had been unticked for some reason. And it was just causing a whole host of issues. So this is now my top tip. Before you do anything else in the environment, just make sure that your time synchronization is working the way you think it should be working. I could give a whole nother talk about NTP, honestly, and how it's misconfigured in nearly every environment that I've come across, but we've only got 45 minutes, so I'll save that for another presentation.
Hey, Mike, you're breaking up a bit there, so maybe turn off the camera.
Yeah, I'll turn off the webcam. All right, how are we sounding now?
Yeah, all good.
Cool. So that was basically me rambling on about NTP, and I could do that forever. But let's get to officially tip number one, and it's changed this year. It is join the world of EUC, Slack, or Discord. It's a fantastic community, and I'm on it. Other people who are smarter than me are also on it. And you get to ask questions, get support, and share your answers to other people's questions. It's a great community. There's a lot of people sharing stuff on there, and it's generally really quick for people to jump on and help you out if you've got an issue. So the link to where you can find the Slack invite is in that QR code, and I encourage everybody who's interested to join up. All right, so this is still in my top tips, the Citrix Optimizer tool. It's got Optimize right there in the name. Now, unfortunately, it hasn't seen a lot of love lately. Martin Zugek, who was looking after it, has left Citrix to go off and join the awesome people at BitDefender. But it's still a great tool, and I still encourage everybody to look into it and learn how to use it, especially with custom templates. All of the Win10 optimizations that Citrix recommends are already in the default packages, so you can take it from there and change settings to your heart's content, essentially. It allows for the use of custom templates. It supports the rollback of settings, which is fantastic. So if you decide that one of the customizations that you've applied isn't working out, you can always roll it back. Of course, if you're using like an automated image build environment, then even better, you can just rebuild without that setting. But if you're still doing things manually, then rollback is fantastic. And there's also the community template marketplace. Now this is getting a bit old now, but there's still some great stuff on there. And if you've got any questions around templates, you can always jump on the world of EUC Slack, and people are sharing their custom templates there as well.
Hey, Mike, just two comments that came in about the NTP issue.
Yeah.
Alan is asking, is this still an issue? Because it used to be an issue in PVS previously that we thought was solved some time ago. But I think it's not so much a PVS issue, more of just a VM issue if they can't sync, right?
So there is a known issue with PVS, and I do believe that it was resolved, but time in general is something to be aware of. So even with sort of the latest patches and stuff with PVS, you just want to bear in mind where everything is syncing and to what and when. So the biggest thing that catches people out, I find, is that people don't realize that the basically the VMs are syncing to that vSphere host on boot, and the vSphere is set to UTC. So it doesn't use time zone files. You can't change it to be in a different time zone. It's in UTC. So when all your images boot, essentially they're getting the time in UTC until they start up Windows and find those cached policy settings that are telling them what their time zone is. And then if they're going off to the domain and the domain's telling them, hey, actually your time zone has changed, or you need to be applying this, and their clock is too far out, and you've got, say, security permissions that only allowed you to read certain group policies after you've been authenticated, then you're going to run into a host of issues, because essentially you're not authenticated on the domain, so you can't read the policy that's telling you what time you need to set because of the permissions on that policy. So you've just got to be careful about like where you're setting NTP settings like whether there's permissions on those settings that are too strict, and the order that everything takes place in, from boot to sort of grabbing the policy, or using cached policies, or like grabbing a policy before you're authenticated against the domain. There's a lot of stuff to think about, and if your time is out, you're essentially an unregistered machine that's just sitting there taking up resources. So yeah, think it through is my tip there, and just make sure that it's working the way you think it should be working.
Yeah, and Jonathan makes a point as well in the questions that anyone who blocks GPO inheritance, that if you forget to rebind the default domain policy, you don't get the maximum tolerance for computer clock synchronization setting for 5 minutes.
Yeah, that's a good point there as well. If you're blocking inheritance, you've got to make sure to relink your NTP policies if they're not being enforced. Yeah.
And there's one other point just on the Citrix Optimizer, that it doesn't support rollback of FX, so just be careful of that.
Yeah, that is a good point too. If you're ripping out UWP apps, it won't put them back in for you. I find a lot of clients say, yeah, we don't need anything from the Windows Store, and then they'll come across and they'll be like, oh, actually, we want like the Windows Store version of Notepad and Paint and Calculator and all of that. And once you've ripped them out, it's an absolute pain to get them back in. So yeah, that's a real good point to keep in mind. VMware Optimizer, should you be using it? In my opinion, if you want to break things and spend hours and possibly days trying to figure out the setting that did it, sure. I have not had a lot of luck with VMware Optimizer, and I've also run into a lot of people who have basically used both Citrix and VMware Optimizer and then deeply regretted it. It is very aggressive in what it optimizes, and by default, it will optimize things that break things that you need in Citrix. So I would say in a Citrix environment, don't. Yeah, you can get maybe a few percentage points more performance than Citrix Optimizer alone, but you're better off building a custom Citrix template with Optimizer with all the settings you need and just using the one tool. It definitely makes it easier, especially with my next tip, because if you're using base image script framework, you can call upon like a Citrix optimization template and have that run as part of your image stealing process. Now, if you're not familiar with the base image scripting framework, I encourage you to get familiar with it, because it's a fantastic tool. Basically, all of the sealing stuff that you might be doing manually now or using other scripts to do, it basically encompasses all of it. And it also does some fantastic stuff with the individual machines so that you can sort of customize settings as they boot as well. It's a really powerful tool. Check it out. So yeah, we talked about how I can incorporate the Citrix Optimizer custom templates. It's great at cleaning up non-persistent images before deployment, MCS or PVS. It has its own ADMX, so you can use GPO to set the optimization options. You can tell it like which Citrix Optimizer templates to use. You can say, hey, anything starting with this sort of format for my optimization template, pick that, and rely on like Citrix Optimizer to pick the right thing for the right operating system. Like it's great for building into like your image management workflows. All right, tip number 4, FSlogix. I still recommend people look at it, even if you're not going to use the profile management part of it. App masking is still a really useful component. Oftentimes, it's faster than UPM for published desktops, and that's like without even configuring any exclusions. Basically, if you've got huge UPM profiles, the issue that you run into, even with things like profile streaming, is that you need to wait for the files to end up on the machine, essentially. So you've got to pull them down over the network at some point. And what FSlogix is doing is loading that whole VHD file that contains your profile over the network and turning all of those network file read and write operations into essentially virtual disk operations. So it's going to speed things up for you there. One thing that we see generally is just changing from UPM to FSlogix. Well, you might have a UPM environment with gigantic profiles. You flick everyone over to FSlogix, and you've gone from, say, a 90-second login to a 20-second login, and that's really without a lot of effort on your part. So if you're looking to optimize login times, I definitely need to consider it. And if not FSlogix, then another disk-based profile solution. Citrix has their own. The issue comes down to essentially if you're using OneDrive. So FSLogix is pretty much required if you want to do OneDrive. It's one of the few supported solutions out there, and it works great with files on demand. You can get it to hold the synchronization cache. It's basically just a fantastic solution for Teams, OneDrive, search roaming. It fixes a lot of issues there, unless you're on server 2019, in which case you still have issues, but there are hot fixes and workarounds for that. If you saw my other talk with Ray Davis and Casper Johansson, we went into a bit of detail on that, but there's still issues even with hot fixes in 2019 where you need to essentially create a scheduled task to reboot the Windows search service to stop the per user search database from locking up that service. But yeah, have a look at that talk, and also have a look at James Kinden's blog on the issue. It goes into a lot of detail there.
Question there, Mike, from Ken. How does FSLogix profile management compare to Ivanti in your experience?
Oh, Ivanti now, I think it's like if you even try and look at the Ivanti stuff, it references using FSlogix for its profile, its disk-based profile management. I know they used to do their own sort of container-based thing to hold the Office and Outlook. If you're using like cache mode, you could hold the cache in like an Ivanti VHD. I honestly haven't touched it for years, and the last time I did touch it, it was such a pain to configure that I wouldn't recommend anybody do it. It could be better now, so I really can't speak to it, but I did not have a great time with it when I last touched it, to the point that I never wanted to touch it again. So that's my experience with Ivanti. So they've updated the FSLogix docs now. This link is still terrible. Like it's almost impossible to find an old version of FSLogix if you want to go and download it. And with some of the latest updates and some of the bugs that they've happened, like you want to be able to easily find the old versions and be able to roll them back. And if anyone out there from Microsoft is listening or watching this presentation, can we just get like a page that has every FSlogix version on it, the release notes for that version, and a link to download that version? Like, I don't think it's too much to ask. The what's new in FSlogix is better. It goes through all of the versions and the changes, so that's fantastic, but there's still no download link to the previous version, and that's really what people have been asking for. All right, tip number 5, upgrade, essentially. And thanks to Nicholas Igniter at Citrix Guru for the image. But LTSR or CR? I would say CR. And here's why. In the same time frame that LTSR went from its initial release to CU8, CR got, I'm going to say 11 billion features, but I don't even know how many it is. It's a lot. And there's been a ton of bug fixes as well, but the feature backporting into 7.15 is like, I mean, it's not designed to have features added to it, essentially. And that's the difference between CR and LTSR, really. The long-term service release gets the bug fixes, and the current release gets the feature updates. Now, by staying on LTSR for, like, 7.15 has been out for a long time as well, right? And if you're not upgrading LTSR like ever, if you're just sitting on the first LTSR that came out, what are you doing? Like, I get that in theory it's supported for 5 years. In practice, the first thing that's going to happen when you call Citrix support is they're going to say, yeah, this issue was fixed in CU whatever, CU3, CU4, CU5. And they're going to suggest that you upgrade straight to CU8. Now, you're not going to want to do that naturally, but you're going to have a hard time with support because they're going to say, well, I mean, we can't really help you with this issue when we know that it's fixed with an upgrade. And to that point, if you're upgrading whenever a new cumulative update comes out, you're pretty much upgrading on the same release cycle that you would be if you were on CR. So if you don't need to be on LTSR, my suggestion would be to move to CR because you're missing out on all the performance benefits. And it's like the difference between LTSR and CR at one point, it was something like 20% capacity was just being wasted, essentially, if you're sitting on LTSR rather than CR. So you've got to ask yourself whether you're happy with sort of not being able to utilize that 20% of the infrastructure that you're paying for. The other thing is you're going to miss out on all of the Teams optimizations because they change pretty much every version. Like just the Teams optimizations get better and better in CR, whereas they're going to stay the same if you're on LTSR. Like you're kind of stuck with what you have. So if you're running Teams inside of VDI, you really want to be on CR.
So you've really shook the hornet's nest here with some of the questions coming in, Mike.
Okay. Well, we'll take a break and have a look at the questions.
Yeah. So probably go and start with what would be some of the use cases for staying on the LTSR?
If you have a vendor that tells you that they're not going to support their application unless you're on a specific LTSR version, then essentially you need to be on LTSR. I know healthcare, a lot of them have vendors that say that they need to be on LTSR in order to get support. So that's a very strong use case.
Point comes in from Felix. So what about if the CR, there could be 0-day bugs within it?
That's very true. They can be. there can also be the same zero-day bugs in LTSR that were only found in a CR version, but exist in both. So there's always that risk. There are going to be bugs in both versions, unfortunately, and you're not really even going to escape bugs that pop up in the cumulative updates, I don't think. If you're worried about bugs, then maybe hang back a version on CR and don't go to the bleeding edge. Or yeah, I mean, if you're cautious, you can wait for other people to do the testing, or you can have your own sort of automated testing platforms with things like Login VSI, where every update you go through the same sort of automated testing and see if anything breaks.
And what's your take then on the new 2203 LTSR, and including all the Teams optimizations that it has?
I would say that if you need to be on LTSR, you should be moving to that. 715 is what is it? It's end of mainstream support, I think, this year. So yeah, I mean, if you need to be on LTSR, then you really should be looking into moving to it. And if you don't need to be on LTSR, I would say be on CR.
Jim asked, they're running an environment on 1912 CU3, soon to be CU5. What release would you think they would go for going forward for better performance? I mean, that's kind of an open question, depending on the environment.
Well, yeah, I mean, it kind of, I'm going to put my consultant hat on and say it depends, but I mean, you're generally going to get the best performance out of the latest version, is what we've found. If you have a very specific reason not to be on the latest version, because it has a bug that impacts your environment or whatever, then yeah, it gets tricky to roll back to find the specific version that sort of has all the features you want before the thing that you need got broken. I mean, I was in that position a couple of years ago where I couldn't, like, my back end was still LTSR and I couldn't upgrade the back end. So we started upgrading the VDA, and then if you go too far forward with the VDA, even though it has that sort of backwards compatibility with the earlier versions, you can't control some of the settings because the policies don't exist in the delivery controllers for the earlier LTSR versions. So yeah, it's a lot of looking at product feature matrices and figuring out, okay, what do I need? Can I get it on this version? Can I get it with just upgrading my VDA past LTSR, or do I need to also do a upgrade on my entire backend? It gets complicated to say what's the best version that I need to be on. It all depends on what you're running, but in general, as a wide blanket statement that's going to annoy everybody, it's the latest version of CR.
Yep. I think if you could just give a quick 30 seconds, then someone's asking, could you just give a quick summary of the difference between LTSR and CR?
A quick difference is that LTSR is designed for you to be able to run it for 5 years and maintain support. And the cumulative updates for LTSR contain bug fixes and security fixes and no feature enhancements that will potentially break the stuff that you're running. And that's the whole idea behind LTSR. And CR is the bleeding edge. It gets updates generally more frequently. There may be bugs. The feature enhancements come thick and fast, especially with Teams optimizations. And if you want to be on the latest and greatest, then those features are really only going to be found in CR.
Yeah, that feeds into a comment here from Scott, who said they moved from 1912 to 2112 because of Teams, and they will never look back now.
Yeah. I mean, once your users are used to the new features that they find in Teams, if you take those away, you're going to be in for a world of hurt. And that's something that we see in Teams as well. Like, because Teams are so hard to control in an enterprise environment, you may get users that have features turned on before other users, even though they're all in the same tenant, just because of the way that Microsoft pushes out updates to Teams, where the Teams software can update on a non-persistent image without you even updating the executable. Like, new features can be enabled on the back end. So you'll have some people get like a different blurred background or something like that, and then everyone else is like, hey, they've got this, and why don't I have it? So yeah, once you get to a point where you've implemented Teams optimizations, you're going to get a lot of pushback from users if you then move to a version that takes those away.
Okay.
So is that it for CR LTSR questions?
Yeah, I think that's it.
All right, I'm going to move on to my next controversial topic, which is fix your AD. So I was going to use a different meme format, but then this happened. So essentially, linking every GPO to the root of your domain increases your logon times and slaps your users in the face. It's crazy that it's 2022. I've pretty much gone my entire consulting life without seeing people link everything to the root of their domain. And then in the last year, I've seen it happen twice. I thought that I wouldn't have to tell people not to map every policy to the root of the domain, but here we are. Don't do it. What ends up happening is that you need to process every single policy to work out whether you need to apply it or not. And if you've got like 9,000 policies, it's going to take a long time. Especially if you've got WMI filtering included in those policies too. So yeah, if you're one of the few people out there where you have an AD environment where everything is linked to the root of the domain, I'm sorry. You're going to have to clean it up at some point, or just build a new AD and migrate. It's going to ruin your VDI prospects. Your login times are going to hurt, and no one's going to have a fun time, especially your Citrix admins that have to implement their own group policies and then deal with everything else that's being thrown at them because it's been linked to the root. So yeah, when's the last time you audited your GPO settings? I get that in a lot of environments, Citrix admins aren't the AD admins, and they don't have a lot of control over it, but the impact on login times from poorly configured GPO is huge. So you need to have some sort of understanding with your AD admins that what they're doing impacts what you need to do in your Citrix environment as well. So if someone in the AD environment has decided that every setting needs to be its own GPO, you need to have a chat with them and just say, hey, look, it's now taking me 20 seconds to process all of the GPO, and that's slowing down everyone's logins. Can we do some consolidation here? And if you can, fantastic. If you can't, maybe what you want to look at is moving all of those settings into something like WEM, and getting them out of GPO entirely, especially if you don't have control over GPO. So that's also something to keep in mind. Especially if you've got a ton of logon scripts. Logon scripts are really going to slow down what's going on in your environment, especially if you need to wait for them to process before you can log in. If you can, consolidate them into one. drive and printer mappings are also going to slow things down. If you are relying on login scripts to map drives, map printers, if you're mapping like a ton of printers per user, it's kind of like a legacy way of doing things these days. You really, if you can, want to move away from drive mappings altogether and move to publishing links to network locations. There's a lot of reasons. Number one would be security, because malware is going to look for map drives and run off and try to encrypt them, like the entire contents of the drive, with whatever permissions the user has, essentially. And if you have like shared team folders where users have access to a whole bunch of files, and they also have like delete or write permissions, then it's a bad time. If you can sort of get that down to a network link or a bunch of network links that just go to relevant locations, then it makes it it makes it harder for the malware essentially to spread to these network drives.
Question there, Mike, from Jim. Where would you suggest applying policies? The Citrix policies, GPO, WEM. Where's the sweet spot there?
Again, it depends on what a Citrix admin has access to in the environment. If you have access to all of it, I would recommend putting them in group policy. If you have access to all of it and you have WEM, put them into WEM, because it's going to be quicker. If you're not comfortable with WEM, or if you don't want to put WEM in because it's just another thing that you have to look after, put them in a group policy. If you don't have access to group policy, you're going to have to put them into Citrix policy or Citrix policies and WEM. So it really all depends. But if you've got free range, the fastest way to do it is going to be WEM. The cleanest way for the next person who comes in after you and doesn't understand WEM is going to be to put it in a group policy.
Do you have any suggestions for older applications that still prefer map drives?
That gets tricky. Nothing specifically. If you're thinking about moving everything to OneDrive, and the reason that you're stopping is because the native OneDrive client doesn't support map drives, you can look into things like Cloud Drive Mapper. That can help you out there. And it may be able to help you out with those legacy applications and other drive mapping things, but I guess that would be my only recommendation, to look into that.
What are your thoughts on item level targeting?
Oh, just it's good for specific things, but you don't want to put it everywhere. Same with WMI filtering. The more sort of targeting that you're doing, and the more that the group policy needs to drill down, the slower things are going to get. It's worse with WMI filtering than item level targeting, I think. But I wouldn't want to see it everywhere, but it is useful for a lot of these settings too. So that's the trade-off.
Yeah, Jonathan makes the point that it's fine if you turn off resultant set to policy.
Okay. Yeah. The danger with that is that then you don't get that feedback when you're troubleshooting GPOs. So that's just something that you need to keep in mind too.
And that was the point was made. Turn it back off when troubleshooting is needed. Of course, a lot of people pointing out as well that for the mapping of drives, you can do that through WEM anyway.
Right. Yeah. This is all good feedback. This is a lot more feedback than I got the last time that I gave this talk. So this is fantastic. Thank you everyone who's jumping in the comments. I honestly can't keep up. The last point is if you've got logon scripts that are pointing to printers or drives that don't exist for that specific user, that's really going to slow things down. So, and this kind of goes back to when was the last time you audited your settings. You need to make sure that the things that are hard baked in login scripts, especially things like mapping drives, drive locations, printers, you need to make sure that those are relevant for the users that they're being applied to. And if there's a ton of irrelevant settings that are getting applied to everyone, then it's probably time to reevaluate what's going on with those scripts. More AD, site services, DNS, DHCP. All of this kind of ties together, unless of course you're not using AD to manage DNS or DHCP. But if you've got undefined subnets and sites and services in VDI land and anywhere really, the server is going to go off and talk to whatever domain controller it can. Now, if your VDAs are in one continent and the domain controller that decides to talk to is in another continent, you're going to get awful latency. And especially if you have to process like 1 million GPOs, you're going to have like just a terrible logon experience. So it's really important when you're building out these new subnets for your VDI to define them and just make sure that it's talking to the closest AD server that it can possibly talk to. And this is especially important when building out new environments in the cloud too. If you are just dropping VDAs into the cloud and then not defining that cloud subnet anywhere in your on-prem sites and services, and you don't have an AD server built out in the cloud, then you can end up with crazy situations where like you've got something in a US region that is then going and talking to like an AD server in Iceland, for example. Like you just need to make sure that you've got this stuff defined essentially. Also stuff in DNS. A lot of times I'll go into an environment and things like callback URLs for NetScaler gateways will be hard-coded into host files on each storefront server instead of defined in DNS because it was just easier to do it that way and they didn't have control over DNS or whatever. But it really makes it difficult for people who are coming in after you. If you sort of define things in host files and not really told anybody why or what that's doing, or even that it has been done, checking a host file is not really the first thing that comes to mind when you're going, oh, why isn't like my smart access control working for my NetScaler gateway? And if you've hard coded like a gateway callback URL to something like and the IP changes, then yeah, it's easier just to define things in DNS so that people can look stuff up. PVS and MCS rely on DHCP, so make sure that your DHCP scopes are large enough for deploying new machines into them. Make sure that your lease times are sensible. Like I have been in environments where people try to set the lease time to the smallest thing possible. And generally I would say, no, please don't do that. Set your lease times to be infinite. And make sure you have a large enough DHCP scope. One environment that I was in, they had the DHCP lease time set to 8 hours. And of course, DHCP starts retrying halfway through that 8-hour interval. And if you're in a environment where the scope is running out, then if it tries to renew and it can't grab an IP, what will happen is that essentially it'll renew. If it can't grab the same IP for whatever reason, it'll try and grab another IP. Everyone who's on that session basically gets disconnected and they can't get back in. So it's rare to see that happen, but I mean, just make sure that your DHCP lease times and scopes are set appropriately. Wow, we're going over time and I've still got a few tips left. So I'm just gonna power through. All right. Unless we have questions for the last thing, and then I can sort of skip this GPU session because it's
no, nothing at the moment, Mike. Keep going.
Nothing at the moment. All right. So prior to pandemic life, I would have said, yes, get a GPU. And now I would say, well, good luck getting a GPU. I was working in like a Server 2019 environment where we had access to NVIDIA Tesla M10s, and we had the app licenses rather than the desktop licenses, which is really, I mean, it's what you need for server OS, but we were finding that it really didn't help as much with a published desktop compared to like a full-on Win 10 desktop with the same vGPU profile assigned to it and using the full-on like NVIDIA desktop licenses. So you really need to evaluate what you want out of the user experience in terms of the desktop. Like if a great graphical experience is necessary, then you're probably looking at individual Windows 10 desktops rather than say a Server 2019 published desktop. Because with that shared desktop, you're just not getting the same bang for your buck out of the GPU profile assignment. If you can't get a GPU, and I mean it's really tricky to get them right now, it would add more RAM to your Zen Desktop VM virtual graphics cards. This used to be a bigger deal in the earlier versions of Zen Desktop. I'm not sure whether this is actually necessary anymore. It's probably something that I need to do some more testing on, but I have seen where just adding additional RAM to the virtual graphics card will help. Adding more RAM to the host, of course, helps, and adding an extra CPU core to make up for the fact that you don't have a GPU core to assign to anything will also help. But the other thing that you need to do is turn off these enable GPU settings for apps, because they're going to try and use that virtual graphics card, and when they do, it's really going to peg the CPU there. The other thing is with Teams, a lot of the Teams optimizations actually require a GPU these days as well. So it's tricky there too. You can do sort of optimized Teams and essentially do the redirection back to the client, which gets around a lot of it. Or if they need the features from like native Teams, I've even heard of people basically just upping the resources on the hosts, assigning GPUs and not even using Teams optimizations at all, and getting the full-blown Teams experience that way. So yeah, it's sort of something to keep in mind. I used to recommend going GPU for everything, and now having done that and having it not be the magic bullet that I thought it would be, I say proceed with caution. Because there's a lot of caveats to GPU as well. You have to look into things like it's harder to vMotion a machine that has a GPU. It takes longer. You have stun times depending on how much virtual memory is in use, because it's got to offload that virtual memory back to system memory and then back to the GPU memory on the other host. You need to keep at least one GPU profiles worth of GPU RAM free so that you can even do the vMotion. So you can't fully load all of the cards. You need to start worrying about things like NVIDIA licenses to servers, driver updates inside the VDA versus driver updates to your vSphere hosts, and making sure you don't go too far forward so that they're out of sync. There's a lot of stuff that then comes into play that makes your life more difficult once you decide to go down the GPU route, and you really need to work out whether that's going to be worth it to your end user experience or not. I mean, if you're doing like CAD CAM work, yeah, it's definitely going to be. If you're just doing Outlook and Chrome, like probably not. Just throw more RAM and CPU at the problem. Fixing video RAM issues. I'm just going to power through this. Hang on. So by default, you've got enough display memory for 2 4K monitors. It's pretty rare that you run out, but you can change the number to completely remove the limit if you're in an environment that needs more than that. What you'll see when you start running out of video RAM is issues with parts of the screen going black and not updating. So if you see that, it's probably an issue related to not having enough video RAM assigned to the virtual desktop drivers, essentially. One way to get around that is to use browser content redirection. It reduces your CPU, GPU load. You can make the client do it. Pretty much any endpoint these days is capable of browser content redirection, even older wires to in clients. So it's definitely something to look into. All right. I mean, I was not expecting this many questions, and I've also changed the format of these slides so that we're now going over time. But if people are still on and they still want to hang around, then we'll keep going. Did we have any questions from the GPU stuff?
Just some comments from folks that you know, they do add complexity, especially with teams and browser content redirection. And some folks saying that, yeah, they put in GPUs, but they actually didn't make much difference in the environment.
Yeah, I mean that's what I was saying as well. So I mean that's kind of why my recommendation is changing to use GPU question mark rather than exclamation point. All right, MCS. So turn on MCS.io. If you're not already using MCS.io,
sorry, Mike.
there are valid reasons not to use MCS.io. So I guess I should go into them. If say you're on a hyperconverged infrastructure, something like Nutanix, in that case, turning on MCS.io is not recommended. But if you aren't doing that, then I would definitely recommend doing it. The defaults will still get you better performance than nothing, but there are ways to, I guess, monitor what's going on to see what size RAM cache you need to assign to stop things paging from RAM to disk. And the bigger the RAM cache, the more everything's going to live in RAM and the less things are going to go to disk. You're always going to get some paging, but if you can get the paging down to as low as possible, then that's going to give you the best performance, because essentially everything's just going to be running out of RAM, or running from RAM rather than running out of RAM. But RAM cache with overflow is the same as in PVS now, so it's using the same technology. It's been that way for a while. You can split your reads off from your writes, and I mean, again, if you're using hyperconverged it doesn't matter really. But if you've got the ability to split your reads from your writes and put them into separate storage pools, you'll see performance benefits there. My other tip, defrag your drive. Yes, it's a virtual disk, but it's still going to make a difference. You see a 30% reduction in write cache disk usage generally. If you defrag a virtual disk, consolidate them, and then defrag that. This takes me on to my next point. Clean up your snapshots, because MTS consolidates snapshot chains at deploy. With 20 snapshots, it takes forever. So I would say with MCS, if you're creating snapshots, try to only keep, say, 3 or 4 snapshots in a chain. If you are going, like if you've got 7, 8 snapshots, maybe create a new base disk, clone the snapshot to a new VM and start again. You really only need 1 snapshot back to be able to revert, and if you've got more than that, it's kind of unnecessary. Especially, I mean, those of you who are doing full-on image automation and are doing like new builds every version, probably aren't even using snapshots at all. But for those of you who are still doing it manually, yeah, the lower the number of snapshots, the faster it's going to take to deploy generally. All right, NetScalers or Citrix ADC. Unless we had questions on the previous stuff.
Yeah, just a couple there. Should I use MTS.io if I'm on an all-flash storage system?
I mean, you can. You're probably not going to see much of a performance benefit, but RAM is still going to be faster than NVMe to a point, but the MTS.io drive is going to add a little bit of complexity to what you're doing. So, I mean, I guess it depends what flash you're on, whether it's sort of SATA SSD or NVMe. If you're on NVMe, I probably wouldn't bother. If it's SATA, maybe. Give it a go. Again, it's sort of, it depends.
Yeah.
I turned it on when we were on SATA SSD, and it did make a noticeable difference. So yeah, I would say have a play with it.
Does the snapshot chain still cause an issue if you're on AHV, or is that just a VMware only issue?
It's mainly a VMware issue. It's also an issue with Hyper-V. With AHV, I think it does snapshots in a completely different way, and you probably don't need to worry about it as much.
Is there value in MCS.io if you're deploying full desktops, static persistent to users?
Oh, that's a good question. Maybe. I haven't put a lot of thought into that.
I don't think I've seen it myself. It's a dedicated machine.
Yeah, I haven't seen it either. Possibly, but then it's all gonna go out of RAM at reboot, and you're gonna have to start loading things back in. I don't know. I probably wouldn't do it just as a gut feeling, but I would need to look into it more.
Yeah, Ryan just pointed out, and I think he's right. It is really only supported for non-persistent. So it is kind of,
yeah, that's a good point too.
Yeah. What other?
We can enable it.
Yeah, one other question about the snapshots. What about MCS in Azure? Because the snaps are kind of independent disk snapshots, so I think it wouldn't apply there because.
Yeah, it doesn't apply there. I've talked to people who, that's a good point, who are doing it in Azure, and they've got 20 snapshots, and it's just as quick on the 20th as it is with the first. So yeah, but basically anything that's using snapshots as like an iteration of the previous thing, and it needs to consolidate snapshots to to build out an image, you're going to run into issues. Anything that treats snapshots as a full disk, you're not going to run into performance issues. That's the sort of how it differs.
Okay, drive on.
All right, NetScaler, fix your routes. Non-VPX, stop routing out your management interface. With VPX, you're typically routing out one interface unless you're doing a more advanced deployment, but you don't have a management interface to worry about. Your management interface doesn't have hardware buffers, can't do 1 gigabit per second, and it will drop packets. And I've seen this in so many places where they're just not defining which interface to send traffic out, and the management interface is the default route, and it'll get saturated and it'll drop packets, and like you'll just have a bad time. If you rely on Mac-based forwarding to make your NetScaler work, you should probably fix your routing instead. Mac-based forwarding can be great. Bear in mind that it is turned on by default in Azure, but I don't like to rely on it to fix issues. I mean, I've been in a lot of situations where I've been like, why is Mac-based forwarding on? And they're like, well, if you turn it off, everything breaks. I'm like, well, maybe we should look at why that's happening instead of just clicking the button. Because it's masking a lot of funny stuff that's going on in your network that you probably want to know about rather than just having it work. You can enable interface binding using NetScaler VLANs, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, I encourage you to scan the QR code and look it up. Now, these VLANs don't sync for HA, so you need to remember to set them up on each HA node. Otherwise, you're going to end up with different routing on different NetScalers during a failover event, which can cause interesting results that you don't want. Or bind your snips to interfaces. You can do it that way as well. Any questions on that?
Nope.
All right, tip 10, and I've talked a bit about automation throughout this whole thing, but automate if you can. And this is kind of where it strays from where I started the talk saying, okay, you want the best bang for your buck, you want to optimize end user experience. This is going the other direction and optimizing your back end user experience. But if you can get to the point where you can make patches and application updates automated, then you keep your end users happy by keeping everything up to date. And if they have a request for a new application, you can basically just drop it into your automation framework and push out a new image in sort of a week rather than a quarter, depending on how long it's been taking you to do stuff. So you can speed things up. There's a lot of upfront investment that needs to take place. So this is why this tip is right at the end. It's not the best bang for buck, but it will get you a fantastic environment after you put in all of that effort. You're removing human error from your image creation process, or if you do break it, at least it's the same everywhere, and the errors are repeatable. And you know what they are as well, because you've got a runbook from your automation framework that tells you every setting that got applied. It makes it easier for the next person that's coming in if they can look at a runbook and go, oh, okay, this is what this setting is doing. This is this version that's being installed. This is the hardware config on this VM. Like, these are all the configuration changes that happen before this thing gets pushed out. In a lot of environments, that knowledge is kept inside the Citrix admin's head, and they will go and they will make these changes to the base image, and not everything is always documented. Once you're in an automated environment, everything is documented, and you know exactly which setting was applied, and you can look at the output logs and see whether a specific setting was applied or whether it failed even. You can make patching part of your image build process so that it's done offline rather than having to sort of spin up a gold image and then wait for Windows Update to go off and grab updates. And if you're interested in that, I would look at OSD Builder or WimWitch or both. OSD Builder has come a long way. If you're on Virtual Expo, there's a fantastic demonstration that David did. And if you weren't, I encourage you to go and look at the replay there. But yeah, in the interest of time, I'm going to wrap it up there. Thanks everyone for hanging on for the extra minutes at the end. And if you've got any questions, I've still got time, so I will hang around and answer them.
Yeah, one more question, Sir Mike. What are your thoughts, for your list there versus SCCM for imaging automation?
I think SCCM is the past, and Packer and Ansible and OSD Builder is the future.
Completely agree.
If you've got everything set up with SCCM or MDT, there's no reason to move away from it if it's working for you. If you're starting your automation journey from scratch, I would be looking at things like Packer and Ansible and Terraform.
Just people asking, will they be able to get the slides? I think they will be available, yes?
The slides themselves, I can make available. There's not really anything in the slide notes that isn't on the screen. I tried to put all of the links to everything in those QR codes. You will be getting a link with the replay so that you can go back through and look at the slides as you like. If you didn't manage to get the QR codes, you can get them from the replay. Otherwise, I will I'll see if I can post them to the My CUGC blog.
I think that's it, Mike. A lot of thank yous.
Yeah, great. Thanks for everyone for sticking around. I may have to cut out some tips for the next time I give this to keep it into 45 minutes, or just ignore all of your questions. But I didn't really want to do that. So thanks everyone for hanging around. Anyone who is going to be at the EUC Masters Retreat, I will also be there, so I'll see you there. If you want to get in contact with me via Twitter or via LinkedIn, feel free to do that. I am O_P on Twitter. I'll go back to my first slide so that you can find me there. Just scan the QR code, that'll take you to my Twitter page or my LinkedIn page. And yeah, happy to answer any other questions that anyone has offline.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mike. I think you thought people were coming for the hair, but they came for the content. Just kidding. No, we really appreciate you doing this for us today. And thank you, Shane, for sorting through all those questions. There was a lot of them today. That was really great.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks everyone for being so engaging. This is the most questions that I've had giving this talk. So it's been fantastic. Thanks.
I'll make sure I'll get you the transcript of those questions too, Mike, so you just have them if you need to refer back to them.
Yeah, that'll be good. There's some that I definitely need to give some more thought to for the next time that I do the presentation.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, everyone. Really appreciate you being here today. And again, you'll get the recording tomorrow, so be on the lookout for that. And I hope you all have an amazing rest of your day wherever you are. Thanks so much.